The White Star drifted through the cold void of space, its once gleaming hull now scarred and battered. The ship had seen better days. It was a proud vessel, one of the finest in the Terran Republic fleet, but now it looked like a ghost of its former self. Alarms blared loudly throughout the corridors, their shrill tones echoing off the metal walls. Lights flickered on and off, casting eerie shadows that danced across the faces of the crew as they scrambled to hold the line against an enemy that refused to give up. Captain Logan Hayes stood at the center of the chaos, his hands gripping the edges of the command console. His face was lined with exhaustion, his gray hair sticking out in messy strands. He had been awake for over 48 hours, and it showed. But despite the fatigue etched into every wrinkle on his face, there was no sign of surrender in his eyes. Those eyes were sharp, focused, and determined. They burned with the fire of a man who knew this might be his final battle, and he wasn't going down without a fight. Around him, the bridge was alive with activity. Crew members shouted orders, checked readouts, and worked frantically to keep the ship intact. Sparks flew from damaged panels and smoke lingered in the air, making it hard to breathe. The White Star groaned under the strain of repeated hits from the Krylos fleet, each impact shaking the ship violently. Everyone could feel it, the inevitability of collapse, yet no one stopped moving, no one gave up, not yet. Report, Logan barked, his voice cutting through the noise like a knife. Lieutenant Rachel Myers hurried to his side, her boots clanging against the metal floor. She was young, maybe in her late 20s, with short brown hair and a look of determination that matched her captain's. Her uniform was smudged with dirt and ash, but she didn't seem to care. Right now, appearances didn't matter. Survival did. "Shields are down to 15%, Rachel said quickly, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Hull integrity is holding, for now, but we've got breaches on decks 7 and 12. Engineering teams are working to seal them, but..." She hesitated, glancing at Logan before finishing softly. "We're running out of time." Logan nodded, his jaw tightening. He had known this moment would come. The Krylos were relentless, their ships faster and more advanced than anything humanity had ever faced. They attacked without mercy, showing no interest in negotiations or truces. For weeks, the White Star had led the charge against them, protecting supply lines and escorting civilian vessels to safety. But even the strongest ships couldn't withstand endless assaults. And now, here they were, cornered, outnumbered, and outgunned. "Evacuate non-essential personnel," Logan ordered, his tone firm. "Get everyone who isn't needed for critical systems onto the escape pods. Now." Rachel hesitated for a split second, then nodded. "Yes, sir." She turned and began relaying the order, her voice steady despite the fear that must have been bubbling beneath the surface. Logan watched her go, feeling a pang of guilt. He hated giving orders that put people in danger, especially when he knew some of them wouldn't make it out alive. But what choice did he have? If they stayed, they'd all die. If they evacuated, at least some of them might survive. As Rachel left the bridge, another figure approached, Engineer Daniel Carter. Daniel was tall and lean, with dark hair that always seemed a little too long and glasses perched precariously on his nose. He looked exhausted, his face streaked with grease and sweat, but there was still a spark of defiance in his eyes. Over the past few weeks, he had become something of a legend aboard the White Star. Time and again, he had patched together failing systems, keeping the ship operational long after it should have fallen apart. Without him, they wouldn't have lasted this long. "Captain," Daniel said, stopping beside Logan, "I've rerouted auxiliary power to the shields. It'll buy us a few more minutes, maybe 10 if we're lucky. But after that..." He trailed off, letting the unspoken implication hang in the air. Logan nodded again, his expression grim. "Good work, Daniel. Keep doing whatever you can. We need every second we can get." Daniel gave a quick nod and turned to leave, already muttering to himself about capacitors and energy matrices. Logan watched him go, feeling a mix of pride and sorrow. Pride because Daniel was exactly the kind of person humanity needed in times like these. Smart, resourceful, and utterly fearless. Sorrow because men like Daniel shouldn't have to risk their lives just to keep a crumbling ship afloat. The sound of another explosion rocked the White Star, throwing several crew members off balance. Logan grabbed onto the console to steady himself, his knuckles turning white as he clenched the edge. Through the viewport, he could see flashes of light as the Krylos ships fired again, their sleek forms cutting through space like sharks circling wounded prey. Each blast sent vibrations rippling through the hull, a constant reminder of how close they were to total destruction. "Sir," came a voice from behind him. Logan turned to see medic Sarah Brooks standing nearby. Sarah was quiet by nature, often fading into the background unless someone needed medical attention. But now she stepped forward, her green eyes filled with concern. "The infirmary is overwhelmed. We've got wounded everywhere, and we're running low on supplies. Some of the injured won't make it if we don't stabilize them soon." Logan felt a weight press down on his chest. More bad news. Of course, that's all there seemed to be these days. Still, he forced himself to remain calm, to think clearly. Panic wouldn't help anyone. "Do what you can," he told Sarah. "Prioritize the most critical cases, and make sure everyone who can walk is helping with the evacuation. We can't afford to waste manpower." Sarah nodded and hurried away, her footsteps fading into the cacophony of alarms and shouting voices. Logan sighed deeply, rubbing a hand over his face. How had it come to this? How had things gone so wrong? He thought back to the beginning of the conflict, to the meetings and debates that had taken place in the halls of the Terran Republic. Back then it had all seemed so simple. Humanity had expanded into the stars, claiming new worlds and resources. The Krylos had objected, claiming those territories as their own. Diplomacy had failed almost immediately, and the war had begun. At first, humanity had believed they could win. After all, they were the dominant species in the galaxy, or so they had thought. But the Krylos were smarter, stronger, and far more ruthless than anyone had anticipated. And now, here they were. The White Star was just one ship among many, but it symbolized everything humanity had fought for. Its loss would be devastating, not just strategically, but emotionally. If the White Star fell, it would send a message to the rest of the Republic. Resistance was futile. Surrender was inevitable. But Logan wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. "Captain," Rachel called, snapping him out of his thoughts. She was, back, her face pale but resolute. "All non-essential personnel are being evacuated. Escape pods are launching as we speak, but..." She paused, swallowing hard. "There aren't enough pods for everyone. Some of us will have to stay behind." Logan met her gaze, his heart heavy. He had known this moment would come too. There was no way around it. Someone had to stay behind to ensure the others escaped. "Someone had to hold the line until the very end. I'll stay," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "You evacuate with the others." "No," Rachel replied instantly, shaking her head. "I'm staying with you. You'll need someone to coordinate communications, and I'm not leaving you alone." Logan wanted to argue, to order her to leave, but he knew it wouldn't do any good. Rachel was as stubborn as he was, and she wouldn't abandon her post, not now, not ever. Besides, deep down he was glad she was staying. He trusted her completely, and having her by his side made the impossible seem slightly less daunting. "Fine," he said finally, giving her a small, grateful smile. "But we're not doing this alone. Get Daniel and Sarah, we'll form a team. Together, we'll make sure the White Star goes down fighting." Rachel nodded, relief flashing across her face. "Yes, sir." As she turned to carry out his orders, Logan took a deep breath and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, beyond the Krylos fleet, reinforcements were on the way. Whether they'd arrive in time was anyone's guess. But Logan didn't plan to wait around to find out. If the White Star was going to fall, it would take as many enemies with it as possible. The White Star groaned as another explosion rocked its battered frame, sending shudders through the ship. In the dimly lit corridors, crew members scrambled to carry out their orders. The evacuation was underway, but chaos still reigned. People shouted over the alarms, their voices strained with urgency. Sparks rained down from damaged panels and smoke filled the air, making it hard to breathe. Despite the growing panic, there was a sense of purpose among those left behind. A shared understanding that they were fighting not just for survival, but for something greater. In the engineering bay, Daniel Carter worked furiously at his station. His hands moved quickly across the console, rerouting power and disabling safety protocols to buy the ship and the evacuating crew more time. Sweat dripped from his brow, and his glasses kept slipping down his nose, forcing him to push them back up every few minutes. Around him, other engineers shouted updates, their faces pale but focused. They knew what was at stake. Every second Daniel bought could mean another life saved. "Core stability is holding," one of the engineers called out, checking a readout on a nearby screen. "But we're pushing the limits. If we overload any further, it'll blow before. We're ready." Daniel nodded without looking up. He already knew the risks. The reactor was unstable, and tampering with it too much could cause a catastrophic failure. But failure wasn't an option, not when so many lives depended on them. He muttered under his breath as he adjusted settings, his mind racing faster than his fingers. There had to be a way to stretch the system just a little longer. "Daniel!" Rachel's voice cut through the noise, startling him. She stood in the doorway, her uniform singed and her face smudged with dirt. "We need to move faster. The Krylos are closing in. We've got less than 15 minutes before they breach the hull." Daniel glanced at her, then back at his console. "I'm doing everything I can," he said, frustration creeping into his tone. "But this isn't magic. I can only work with what we've got." Rachel stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. Her touch was firm but reassuring. "I know you are," she said softly. "And we need you to keep doing it. Just try to hurry." Daniel nodded, swallowing hard. He didn't respond, focusing instead on the task at hand. Time was running out, and he couldn't afford distractions. With renewed determination, he dove back into his work, his fingers flying across the controls. Meanwhile, on the bridge, Logan paced back and forth, his eyes darting between the viewport and the various screens displaying critical information. Outside, the Krylos fleet loomed large, their sleek ships glowing ominously against the blackness of space. Each blast shook the white star, sending debris spinning into the void. The enemy was relentless, firing wave after wave of energy weapons that tore through the ship's weakened defenses. "Status update," Logan barked, stopping beside Rachel as she returned from the engineering bay. "The shields are failing," Rachel replied, her voice tight. "At this rate, they'll collapse within 10 minutes, and if that happens—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. They both knew what it meant. Without shields, the Krylos would board the ship, and no amount of resistance would stop them. Logan clenched his jaw, his mind racing. There had to be a way out, a plan, however desperate, that could turn the tide. As if reading his thoughts, the communications panel crackled to life. A familiar voice came through, calm but urgent. "Captain Hayes, do you copy?" It was Commander Ava Torres, leader of the Eclipse Squadron. Her squadron had been stationed nearby, waiting for reinforcements to arrive. Logan grabbed the mic, relief flooding through him at the sound of her voice. "Ava, this is Hayes. Go ahead." "We're monitoring your situation," Ava said, her tone grim. "Reinforcements are en route, but they won't reach you in time. You're on your own for now." Logan closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the news. He had hoped for a miracle, but deep down he'd known better. Still, hearing it confirmed made his stomach churn. "What about options?" he asked, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "Anything we can do to hold them off?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Logan imagined Ava weighing her words carefully. Finally, she spoke. "There's one possibility, but it's risky. Detonate your core near the Krylos fleet. The resulting explosion should cripple their advance long enough for the evacuees to escape." Logan's heart sank. He had suspected such a plan might be their only hope, but hearing it aloud made it painfully real. Sacrificing the White Star, and everyone still aboard, wasn't just risky, it was suicidal. Yet as he looked around the bridge at the faces of his remaining crew, he knew they all understood the stakes. This was war, and sometimes victory required sacrifice. "I'll consider it," Logan said finally, his voice low. "Thank you, Ava. Keep us updated." "Good luck, Captain," Ava replied before cutting the transmission. Logan set the mic down and turned to Rachel, who had been listening intently. Her expression was unreadable, though her knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of the AE console. For a moment neither of them spoke. The weight of the decision hung heavy in the air. "We don't have a choice, do we?" Rachel asked quietly, breaking the silence. Logan shook his head. "No, we don't. But I won't ask anyone to stay unless they're willing. This is our fight, but it doesn't mean we drag others down with us." Rachel nodded, her resolve returning. "Then let's assemble the team. We'll make sure everyone knows what's at stake." Later, in a small conference room adjacent to the bridge, Logan gathered his loyal team: Rachel, Daniel, and Sarah Brooks, the medic who had stayed behind to tend to the wounded. The four of them sat around a makeshift table, their faces illuminated by the faint glow of emergency lights. The atmosphere was tense, each person bracing themselves for what Logan was about to say. "I won't sugarcoat this," Logan began, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "The White Star is going down. The Krylos are too close and we can't hold them off much longer. Our best chance to protect the evacuees and give humanity a fighting chance is to detonate the core near the enemy fleet." The room fell silent, the gravity of his words sinking in. No one spoke immediately, though the shock was evident on their faces. Daniel pushed his glasses up his nose, his brow furrowed in thought. Sarah stared at the table, her hands clasped tightly together. Rachel met Logan's gaze, her expression resolute. "How much time will it buy us?" Daniel asked finally, his voice quiet. "Enough," Logan replied. "Ava says it'll cripple their advance and give the evacuees a chance to regroup. It's not perfect, but it's all we've got." "And what about us?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happens to us?" Logan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "We won't survive, but if we succeed, we'll save thousands of lives. That's worth dying for." For a long moment, no one responded. The reality of their situation settled over them like a suffocating blanket. They weren't soldiers or warriors. They were ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Yet here they were, facing death head-on, united by a shared purpose. "I'm in," Rachel said suddenly, breaking the silence. "If we're going down, I want it to mean something." "Me too," Daniel added, nodding firmly. "I didn't spend weeks keeping the ship alive just to let it fall apart now." Sarah took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "I'm staying too," she said softly. "Someone needs to make sure we go out with dignity." Logan looked at each of them, pride swelling in his chest despite the sorrow threatening to overwhelm him. These were good people, brave, selfless, and true heroes. Together, they would ensure the White Star went out in a blaze of glory. The White Star was dying, its life slipping away with every passing second. The ship groaned under the relentless assault from the Krylos fleet, each hit sending tremors through the hull. Sparks rained down in the corridors and smoke filled the air, making it hard to breathe. Despite the chaos, the remaining crew worked tirelessly to carry out their final mission. Every action they took was deliberate, every decision weighed against the clock ticking down to destruction. In the engineering bay, Daniel Carter stood at the reactor console, his hands trembling as he input commands. The reactor core hummed, ominously, its energy levels climbing higher than they were ever meant to go. Daniel knew the risks. Pushing the system this far could cause an early detonation, killing everyone aboard instantly. But there was no other choice. They needed the explosion to be big enough to cripple the Krylos fleet. Failure wasn't an option. "Come on," Daniel muttered under his breath, his eyes glued to the readouts. Just a little more. Behind him, two engineers worked frantically to stabilize the auxiliary systems, their faces pale but focused. One of them glanced nervously at the reactor, then back at Daniel. "Are you sure this is going to work?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Over the alarms, Daniel didn't look up. "It has to," he said simply. "If it doesn't, none of this matters anyway." The engineer nodded, though doubt lingered in his eyes. He returned to his task, tightening bolts and rerouting power lines to keep the ship from falling apart. Before the reactor reached critical mass, around them, The engineering bay shook violently as another blast from the Krylos fleet struck the white star. Metal screeched, and the lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness for a brief moment, before emergency lighting kicked in. On the bridge, Logan Hayes paced back and forth, his mind racing. The countdown had begun, and every second felt like an eternity. Outside the viewport, the Krylos ships loomed closer, their sleek forms cutting through space like predators closing in on their prey. Each blast sent vibrations rippling through the hull, a constant reminder of how close they were to total collapse. Rachel Myers sat at her station, her fingers flying across the controls as she coordinated the evacuation efforts. Her face was pale, but her movements were steady. She had spent years training for situations like this, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of it. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders, but she refused to let it show. Not now. Not when so much depended on her. "How many pods left?" Logan asked, stopping beside her. "3 more," Rachel replied without looking up. "But we're running out of time. The Krylos are almost within boarding range." Logan clenched his jaw, his fists tightening at his sides. If the enemy breached the hull before the last pods launched, the evacuation would fail. And if that happened, everything they were sacrificing themselves for would be for nothing. He couldn't let that happen, not after everything they'd endured. "Tell the pilots to move faster," Logan ordered. "We need those pods gone now." Rachel nodded and relayed the message, her voice calm but urgent. Across the comm channels, she heard acknowledgments from the escape pod crews. They were doing everything they could, but the process was slow. Too slow. The tension on the bridge was palpable, everyone holding their breath as they waited for confirmation that the last pod had launched. Meanwhile, in the lower decks, Sarah Brooks moved quickly through the corridors, checking on wounded crew members and helping them reach safety. Her medical kit was nearly empty, its supplies depleted after weeks of treating injuries sustained during the Krylos attacks. Still, she did what she could, offering comfort and reassurance to those who wouldn't survive. As she rounded a corner, Sarah spotted Communications Officer Eric Lane crouched near a damaged panel. His uniform was torn, and his face was streaked with dirt and ash. He looked panicked, his hands trembling as he fiddled with wires. Something about his behavior seemed off. He was acting strangely, almost guilty. Sarah slowed her pace, watching him carefully. "Eric," she called out, her voice cautious. "What are you doing?" Eric froze, his head snapping up in surprise. For a moment, he just stared at her, his eyes wide with fear. Then, without a word, he turned and bolted down the corridor, disappearing into the shadows. Sarah hesitated, unsure whether to follow him or continue with her duties. Something didn't feel right. Eric's actions were suspicious, and in a situation like this, suspicion could mean betrayal. Making a quick decision, she grabbed her communicator and contacted Rachel. "Rachel, it's Sarah," she said urgently. "I think we might have a problem. Eric Lane is acting strange. He just ran off when I tried to talk to him." There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by Rachel's sharp intake of breath. "Stay with him," she instructed. "Find out what he's up to, but be careful. We can't afford any surprises right now." Sarah nodded, even, though Rachel couldn't see her. "Understood." She set off in pursuit of Eric, her footsteps echoing softly in the deserted corridor. Ahead, she caught glimpses of his shadow as he darted around corners, trying to lose her. But Sarah was determined. She had seen too much death already. She wasn't about to let someone jeopardize their chances of survival. Finally, she cornered him in a maintenance bay. Eric stood with his back to her, his hands working furiously at a console. When he heard her approach, he spun around, his face pale and sweaty. In his hand, he held a small device, a detonator. "Stay back," Eric shouted, his voice shaking. "I don't want to hurt anyone, but I will if I have to." Sarah raised, her hands slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. "Eric, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice calm despite the fear coursing through her veins. "You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do," Eric snapped, tears welling up in his eyes. "They promised they'd spare my family if I helped them. I didn't have a choice." Sarah's stomach churned. So it was true. Eric had been working with the Krylos. Betrayal cut deep, especially in moments like this, when trust was all they had left. But Sarah forced herself to stay focused. She couldn't let anger cloud her judgment. "Helping them won't save your family," she said gently, taking a small step forward. "You know that. The Krylos don't care about us. They'll kill everyone, including your loved ones once. They've taken what they want." Eric hesitated, his grip on the detonator loosening slightly. Doubt flickered in his eyes, but it wasn't enough. He shook his head, backing away from her. "No. You're lying. You don't understand. They
gave me no choice."
Before Sarah could respond, Eric pressed the button on the detonator. A loud explosion rocked the ship, throwing her to the ground. Flames erupted from the damaged panel behind Eric, forcing him to stumble backward. Smoke filled the air, choking her lungs as she struggled to her feet. "Idiot!" Sarah shouted, coughing as she lunged toward him. She tackled him to the ground, pinning his arms beneath her knees. The detonator clattered to the floor, sliding out of reach. Eric thrashed. Beneath her, his face contorted with panic and guilt. "You've made things worse," Sarah yelled, her voice rising above the roar of the flames. "Do you realize what you've done? We're trying to save lives here, not destroy them." Eric stopped struggling, his body going limp as the reality of his actions sank in. Tears streamed down his face as he looked up at her, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." Sarah sighed, her anger giving way to pity. She pulled him to his feet, keeping a firm grip on his arm. "Come on," she said, sharply. "We need to get back to the bridge. Logan needs to know about this." Back on the bridge, Logan listened intently as Sarah recounted what had happened. His expression darkened with each word, his jaw tightening until it felt like it might crack. Betrayal was something he had always feared, but never expected to face. Not here, not now. "So Eric sabotaged the ship?" Logan asked, his voice low and dangerous. Sarah nodded. "He says the Krylos threatened his family. He thought he was protecting them, but..." She trailed off, shaking her head. "He didn't think about the consequences." Logan exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. The damage caused by Eric's actions had set them back further than they could afford. Daniel would have to divert precious resources to contain the fire, slowing down the reactor overload process. Time was slipping away faster than ever. "Bring him here," Logan ordered finally. "We'll deal with him later. For now, tell Daniel to focus on fixing the breach. We can't afford any more delays." Sarah nodded and left the bridge, dragging Eric behind her. As they disappeared down the corridor, Logan turned back to the viewport. The Krylos fleet was closer now, their weapons charging for another volley. The White Star was running out of time, and so were they, but Logan wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The White Star was falling apart piece by piece. Flames licked at the walls in the lower decks where Eric's sabotage had caused an explosion that tore through a section of the ship. Smoke filled the corridors, making it hard to breathe and forcing the remaining crew to wear oxygen masks just to stay alive. Alarms blared endlessly, their piercing tones mixing with the groans of the damaged hull as the Krylos fleet continued its relentless assault. Every second felt like an eternity, every blast bringing the ship closer to total collapse. Daniel Carter worked furiously in the engineering bay, his hands moving across the console with desperate precision. The reactor core hummed louder than ever, its energy levels climbing dangerously high. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes, but he didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. The fire caused by Eric's sabotage had forced him to reroute power from auxiliary systems to contain the blaze, leaving less energy for the reactor overload. It was a delicate balance, one wrong move away from disaster. "Come on," Daniel muttered under his breath, staring at the readouts. "Just hold together a little longer." Behind him, two engineers struggled to seal a breach in the wall where flames still flickered. They worked quickly, welding metal plates over the gap to prevent the fire from spreading further. Sparks flew into the air and the heat was almost unbearable, but they pressed on, knowing their lives depended on it. The ship shook violently as another blast from the Krylos fleet struck the hull, sending tools clattering to the floor and nearly knocking Daniel off his feet. "Status." Daniel shouted over the noise, glancing back at the engineers. "We've contained the fire," one of them replied, his voice strained. "But the structural integrity is failing. We don't have much time." Daniel nodded grimly, turning his attention back to the reactor. He knew what the engineer meant. They were running out of time in more ways than one. The Krylos were closing in, and the White Star wouldn't last much longer. If they didn't finish the overload process soon, the entire mission would fail. And failure wasn't an option, not when so many lives depended on them. On the bridge, Logan Hayes stood at the viewport, watching as the Krylos ships grew larger with every passing second. His jaw was clenched tightly, his fists balled at his sides. Outside, the enemy fleet loomed like a swarm of insects, their sleek forms glowing ominously against the blackness of space. Each blast sent shudders through the White Star, shaking the bridge and reminding everyone aboard that their end was near. Rachel Myers sat at her station, her fingers flying across the controls as she monitored the evacuation efforts. Her face was pale, but her movements were steady. She had spent the past hour ensuring all civilians and non-essential personnel were safely aboard escape pods. Now, only a handful of crew members remained, those who had chosen to stay behind to carry out the final mission. The last pod had launched minutes ago, carrying the survivors to safety. But the cost of that safety weighed heavily on Rachel's mind. "How long until detonation?" Logan asked, his voice low but urgent. Rachel checked the timer on her screen. 5 minutes, she replied. "But the Krylos are almost within boarding range. If they breach the hull before then, we're done." Logan nodded, his expression grim. He turned to Sarah Brooks, who stood nearby tending to a wounded crew member. "Sarah, get everyone to the bridge. We need to stick together for this." Sarah nodded without hesitation, helping the injured man to his feet. "Understood," she said softly, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. She guided the man toward the door, then hurried off to gather the rest of the remaining crew. As Sarah left, Eric Lane shuffled into the room, his hands bound tightly behind his back. His face was streaked with dirt and ash, and his eyes were red from crying. Guilt and fear radiated off him in waves, but there was no anger in his expression, only resignation. He knew what he had done, and he knew there was no undoing it. Logan stepped forward, stopping directly in front of Eric. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Logan's gaze bore into Eric's, searching for something, regret, remorse, anything that might justify sparing him. But Eric simply looked down at the floor, unable to meet Logan's eyes. "You betrayed us," Logan said finally, his voice cold and steady. "You put everyone on this ship at risk, all for a promise you should have known wasn't real." Eric flinched at the words, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't know what else to do." Logan sighed deeply, his shoulders sagging slightly. There was no point in wasting time punishing Eric. Not now, not when they had mere minutes left to live. Instead, he turned to Rachel. "Keep an eye on him," he ordered. "Make sure he doesn't cause any more trouble." Rachel nodded, stepping forward to take Eric by the arm. She guided him to the corner of the bridge, keeping a firm grip on him as she returned to her station. Eric didn't resist. He seemed to understand that his fate was sealed, whether by the Krylos or the exploding reactor. In the engineering bay, Daniel completed the final adjustments to the reactor. The core was now fully primed, its energy levels teetering on the edge of critical mass. One more command would trigger the countdown, setting the White Star on a collision course with destruction, and hopefully taking the Krylos fleet with it. "Core overload initiated," Daniel announced over the comm system, his voice echoing across the ship. "Detonation in 4 minutes, 30 seconds. The announcement sent a wave of tension through the remaining crew. On the bridge, Logan took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He glanced at Rachel, then at Sarah, both of whom nodded silently in acknowledgement. They were ready, or as ready as they could be. "Evacuate engineering," Logan ordered, his voice firm. "Get everyone up here now." Daniel hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the console. He wanted to stay, to ensure the reactor didn't fail at the last second. But he knew Logan was right. The engineering bay was too dangerous, and the countdown couldn't be stopped once it began. With a heavy heart, Daniel grabbed his toolkit and headed for the door, joining the other engineers as they made their way to the bridge. Back on the bridge, the remaining crew gathered together, forming a tight circle around Logan. The atmosphere was tense but strangely peaceful. There was no more shouting, no more panic, just a quiet acceptance of what was about to happen. Everyone knew they weren't going to survive, but they also knew their sacrifice would mean something. It would save lives, buy humanity time to regroup and strike a blow against the Krylos that would echo through the stars. 3 minutes, Rachel announced, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft but steady, a reminder of how little time they had left. Logan stepped forward, addressing the group. "This isn't how I imagined things ending," he said quietly, his voice tinged with sadness. "But I'm proud to stand here with all of you. What we're doing today matters. It's bigger than any one of us, bigger than this ship. When people look back on this day, they'll remember what we did. They'll remember that we held the line." No one spoke, but nods of agreement rippled through the group. Tears welled up in some eyes while others stared straight ahead, their expressions resolute. Even Eric, standing in the corner with his hands still bound, looked up at Logan with a mixture of guilt and gratitude. He didn't deserve forgiveness, but Logan's words offered him a small measure of peace. 2 minutes, Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. Logan turned to face the viewport, watching as the Krylos fleet drew closer. Their ships were massive, their weapons glowing ominously as they prepared to deliver the final blow. The White Star was battered and broken, its once proud hull reduced to scrap metal. But it still had one last trick up its sleeve, a final act of defiance that would go down in history. 1 minute, Rachel announced, her voice cracking slightly. Logan closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. Memories flashed through his mind, his wife waiting for him back on Earth, the friends he'd lost during the war, the ideals he'd fought for. He thought about the countless lives that depended on them, the future they were fighting to protect. And he smiled just a little, knowing that their sacrifice wouldn't be in vain. 30 seconds, Rachel said, her voice trembling. The countdown ticked away, each second feeling like an eternity. The Krylos fleet was close enough now to see clearly through the viewport, their ships looming large against the backdrop of space. The White Star groaned under the strain of another blast, sending shudders through the bridge. But no one moved. No one spoke. They simply waited, holding their breath as the timer reached its final moments. 10 seconds, Rachel whispered. Logan opened his eyes, looking at the faces of his crew one last time. They were scared, yes, but they were also brave. Together, they had faced the impossible and refused to give up, and now together they would face the end. 5, 4, 3, 2. The White Star erupted in a brilliant explosion, obliterating the Krylos fleet and creating a temporary barrier that halted their advance. The shockwave rocked nearby ships, including the Eclipse Squadron, which narrowly escaped destruction. The explosion lit up the darkness of space like a second sun. For a brief moment, the universe seemed to hold its breath as the White Star unleashed its final act of defiance. The shockwave rippled outward, engulfing the Krylos fleet in a blinding inferno. Ships that had once been sleek and menacing were torn apart, their hulls rupturing under the sheer force of the blast. Debris scattered across the void, glowing embers drifting aimlessly in the wake of destruction. On board the Eclipse Squadron, Commander Ava Torres watched the scene unfold with a mixture of awe and sorrow. The White Star was gone, its crew, its captain, everyone who had stayed behind to ensure the evacuation's success. They had sacrificed themselves to protect the survivors, buying humanity precious time to regroup and fight another day. It was a victory, but one that came at an unimaginable cost. "Status report," Ava ordered, her voice steady despite the weight pressing down on her chest. "Multiple Krylos ships destroyed or disabled," one of her officers replied, his tone tinged with disbelief. "Their advance has been halted for now." Ava nodded, her gaze fixed on the viewport. The remnants of the Krylos fleet were retreating, their remaining ships pulling back into the depths of space. But she knew this wasn't the end. The Krylos wouldn't give up easily. This battle might have been won, but the war was far from over. Still, for now, they had a reprieve, a chance to catch their breath and prepare for what lay ahead. And that was thanks to the bravery of the White Star crew. In the silence that followed the explosion, the surviving members of the Terran Republic fleet gathered aboard the Eclipse Squadron. The mood was somber, the air thick with grief and exhaustion. Escaped pods from the White Star had been recovered, their occupants shaken but alive. Families clung to each other, grateful to be reunited, while others mourned those they had lost. The faces of the survivors told stories of pain, fear, and resilience, all woven together by the shared experience of narrowly escaping death. Commander Ava Torres stood at the center of it all, her presence offering a sense of stability in the chaos. She moved among the survivors, speaking softly to those who needed reassurance, listening to their stories and sharing in their sorrow. Though she carried the burden of leadership, she didn't shy away from showing compassion. These people had endured unimaginable horrors, and they deserved to know that their sacrifices hadn't been forgotten. As Ava walked through the crowded corridors, she spotted someone sitting alone near a viewport. It was Emily Hayes, Captain, Logan Hayes' wife. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. In her hands, she clutched a small holodisc, the last recorded message Logan had sent before the White Star's destruction. Ava hesitated for a moment, then approached her quietly. "Emily," Ava said gently, taking a seat beside her. "I'm so sorry." Emily looked up, her expression hollow but composed. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He always said duty came first. I never thought it would mean losing him." Ava placed a hand on Emily's shoulder, offering what little comfort she could. "Logan was a hero," she said firmly. "What he and his crew did today saved countless lives. They gave us a fighting chance. We owe them everything." Emily nodded slowly, clutching the holodisc tighter. "I know," she said softly, "but it doesn't make it hurt any less." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They simply sat there, staring out at the stars, lost in their own thoughts. The vastness of space stretched out before them, indifferent to the struggles of those who called it home. Yet somewhere within that infinite expanse, the echoes of Logan's bravery and the sacrifices of his crew would continue to resonate. Later, aboard the Eclipse Squadron, Ava held a meeting with her senior officers. The room was dimly lit, the atmosphere heavy with tension. Maps and holographic projections floated above the table, displaying the current state of the battlefield. The Krylos retreat had given them a temporary advantage, but Ava knew better than to let her guard down. The enemy would regroup, and when they returned, they would come stronger than ever. "We need to use this time wisely," Ava began, her voice firm but measured. "The White Star bought us a window of opportunity, but it won't last forever. We have to strike back before the Krylos recover." Her officers nodded, their expressions grim but determined. Each of them understood the stakes. The survival of humanity depended on their next move. "What about reinforcements?" one officer asked, leaning forward. "Are we expecting more ships?" Ava shook her head. "Not anytime soon. The nearest fleet is still days away. Until then, we're on our own." Another officer spoke up. "What about the evacuees? Can we integrate them into our ranks?" "We'll do what we can," Ava replied. "Many of them are civilians, but some served aboard the White Star. If they're willing to fight, we'll arm them and bring them into the fold. Every hand counts." The discussion continued, strategies forming and plans taking shape. Ava listened intently, weighing every suggestion carefully. She knew the decisions she made in the coming hours would determine the fate of humanity. There was no room for error, not now, not after everything they had already lost. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of the ship, Eric Lane sat alone, his hands still bound tightly behind his back. His betrayal had nearly cost them everything, and though he had been forgiven by Logan in those final moments, he couldn't forgive himself. The guilt weighed heavily on his shoulders, pressing down until it felt like he couldn't breathe. Sarah. Brooks approached him cautiously, her medical kit in hand. She attended to his injuries earlier, treating the cuts and burns he had sustained during the explosion. Now she returned to check on him, her expression unreadable. "How are you holding up?" Sarah asked, kneeling beside him. Eric shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "I don't deserve your help," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "After what I did?" Sarah sighed deeply, setting her kit down beside her. "You made a mistake," she said evenly. "A terrible one. But mistakes can be forgiven if you're willing to make amends." Eric looked at her, his eyes filled with doubt. "How can I make up for what I've done? I betrayed my crew, my ship. I helped destroy the White Star." "You didn't destroy it," Sarah corrected him firmly. "The White Star went down, fighting, for something bigger than itself. That's not your doing. What matters now is what you choose to do next." Eric hesitated, considering her words. He had spent so long consumed by guilt and fear that he hadn't allowed himself to think beyond his own shame. But Sarah was right. He couldn't change the past. All he could do was try to honor the sacrifices of those who had died by doing whatever he could to help. "I want to fight," Eric said finally, his voice shaky but resolute. "If there's anything I can do to make things right, I'll do it. Whatever it takes." Sarah smiled faintly, nodding in approval. "Good," she said simply. "We'll find a place for you." Back in the main hall of the Eclipse Squadron, Ava addressed the survivors. The room was packed, every available seat filled as men, women, and children gathered to hear her speak. Their faces were weary, their bodies battered, but their spirits remained unbroken. They had endured the unthinkable, and now they stood united, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. "Today, we lost heroes," Ava began, her voice strong and clear. "Captain Logan Hayes and the crew of the White Star gave everything to protect us. They held the line when it mattered most, and because of them, we're still here. Their sacrifice will not be forgotten." A murmur of agreement rippled through, the crowd heads nodding in solemn acknowledgement. Tears welled up in some eyes while others clenched their fists in determination. "But their fight isn't over," Ava continued. "It falls to us now, to carry the torch, to keep moving forward. The Krylos may have taken much from us, but they haven't taken our hope. As long as we stand together, they will never win." The room erupted in applause, cheers echoing off the walls as the survivors rose to their feet. For the first time in days, there was a spark of hope, a belief that they could overcome the odds stacked against them. Ava watched silently, her heart swelling with pride. The road ahead would be difficult, but if anyone could rise to the challenge, it was these people. Hours later, as the Eclipse Squadron prepared to move out, Ava stood alone on the bridge, staring out at the stars. The memory of the White Star lingered in her mind, its fiery demise etched into her soul. She thought about Logan, Rachel, Daniel, Sarah, all the brave souls who had given their lives to save humanity. Their legacy would live on, not just in the stories told by survivors, but in the actions of those who followed in their footsteps. "We won't let you down," Ava whispered, her voice barely audible. "Your sacrifice will mean something, I promise." And with that, she turned away from the viewport, ready to lead her people into the next chapter of their fight for survival. Weeks had passed since the destruction of the White Star, but its memory lingered like a shadow over the Terran Republic fleet. The survivors aboard the Eclipse Squadron and other ships carried the weight of that sacrifice with them, their grief tempered only by the knowledge that it had not been in vain. The Krylos advance had been halted, giving humanity a chance to regroup and rebuild. But the war was far from over, and the scars left behind ran deep. Commander Ava Torres stood on the bridge of the Eclipse Squadron, her eyes fixed on the stars outside the viewport. She had spent countless hours poring over maps, strategizing with her officers and preparing for the battles ahead. Yet despite her determination, She couldn't shake the feeling of loss that clung to her. Every decision she made felt heavier now, every order tinged with the knowledge of what others had given up so she could keep fighting. Today, however, was different. Today wasn't about planning or strategy. It was about remembrance. The fleet had gathered in a quiet sector of space, far from the front lines, to honor the fallen crew of the White Star. Ships hung motionless against the vastness of the void, their lights dimmed as a sign of respect. On board each vessel, survivors gathered to pay tribute to those who had sacrificed everything. Ava stepped onto the podium at the center of the Eclipse Squadron's main hall, where hundreds of people had assembled. Their faces were somber, their uniforms marked with patches of wear and tear from weeks of hard fighting. Some held holodiscs containing messages from loved ones lost aboard the White Star. Others simply stared ahead, their expressions blank, but their eyes filled with unspoken emotion. "Today," Ava began, her voice steady but soft, "we remember heroes." The room fell silent, every ear tuned to her words. Captain Logan Hayes and his crew chose to stand when others might have fled. They chose to fight when surrender seemed easier. They gave their lives so that we could live, and because of them, we are here today. Their bravery will never be forgotten. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the crowd. Tears glistened in some eyes while others clenched their fists, drawing strength from the memories of those they had lost. Logan was a leader, Ava continued, her voice growing stronger. But he wasn't alone. Lieutenant Rachel Myers stayed by his side, ensuring communications remained intact until the very end. Engineer Daniel Carter worked miracles in the engineering bay, keeping the ship alive long enough to complete its mission. Medic Sarah Brooks tended to the wounded, offering comfort even as the ship fell apart around her. "And yes," she added, glancing toward Eric Lane, who stood quietly in the back of the room. Even those who faltered found redemption in their final moments. Eric shifted uncomfortably under the attention, but Ava didn't dwell on him. Instead, she focused on the broader message. What matters isn't how we fall, it's how we rise. The crew of the White Star taught us that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the willingness to act despite it. And because of them, we have hope. The room erupted in applause, cheers echoing off the walls as the survivors rose to their feet. For a brief moment, the pain of loss was overshadowed by pride, a shared understanding that the sacrifices of the White Star had not been in vain. Ava watched silently, her heart swelling with both sorrow and gratitude. Later, aboard the Eclipse Squadron, Emily Hayes sat alone in her quarters, clutching the holodisc Logan had recorded before the White Star's destruction. She had watched the message countless times, replaying his words over and over in her mind. Each viewing brought fresh tears, but also a renewed sense of purpose. Logan's final message wasn't just a goodbye. It was a call to action. The disc flickered to life, projecting Logan's image into the air. His face was lined with exhaustion, his gray hair sticking out in messy strands, but his eyes burned with determination. "Emily," he began, his voice warm despite the gravity of the moment. "If you're watching this, then I'm gone. I want you to know that I love you more than anything in this universe. You've been my anchor through all of this, the reason I kept fighting even when things seemed impossible." He paused, taking a deep breath. "But this isn't just about me, it's about all of us, about the future we're trying to build, for you, for our children, for everyone who believes in a better tomorrow. If I don't make it back, promise me you'll keep fighting. Promise me you won't give up." Tears streamed down Emily's face as she listened to his words. She had always known Logan was a man of duty, someone who put the needs of others above his own. But hearing him speak so openly about his love for her and his hopes for the future made the loss feel even sharper. "I promise," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'll keep fighting. For you. For all of us." With a heavy heart, she turned off the holodisc and set it aside. Rising from her seat, she straightened her uniform and took a deep breath. Logan's death had left a void in her life, but it had also ignited a fire within her. She wouldn't let his sacrifice or the sacrifices of the White Star crew be forgotten. She would carry their legacy forward, no matter what it took. As the days passed, the fleet prepared to return to the front lines. Reinforcements had finally arrived, bolstering their numbers and giving them the strength they needed to push back against the Krylos. Morale was high, fueled by the stories of heroism and sacrifice that had spread throughout the ranks. The crew of the White Star had become legends, their names spoken with reverence and awe. Among the survivors, Eric Lane found a new sense of purpose. Though guilt still weighed heavily on him, he threw himself into his work, determined to prove that he deserved a second chance. Assigned to a repair team, he spent long hours fixing damaged systems and helping maintain the fleet's ships. His hands moved quickly, his focus unwavering. He didn't speak much, but his actions spoke volumes. One evening, as he worked alone, in the engineering bay, Sarah approached him. She carried a tray of food, setting it down beside him with a small smile. "You should eat," she said simply. "You've been working non-stop for hours." Eric glanced up, surprised by her kindness. "Thanks," he muttered, wiping grease from his hands. I want to do something useful. Anything." Sarah nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "You're doing more than you realize," she said gently. "Every bolt you tighten, every system you repair, that's making a difference. Don't forget that." Eric hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I guess," he admitted. "It's just hard to forgive myself." "No one expects you to," Sarah replied. "But forgiveness isn't something you wait for. It's something you earn. Keep doing what you're doing and eventually you'll find peace." Her words stayed with him long after she left, lingering in his mind like a lifeline. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to believe that redemption was possible, that he could honor the memory of those he had wronged by becoming someone worthy of their trust. Back on Earth, news of the White Star's sacrifice reached the public, sparking an outpouring of support for the war effort. Cities lit up with memorials, their skies illuminated by drones forming the shape of the fallen ship. Families gathered to share stories of loved ones lost in the conflict, their voices filled with both sorrow and pride. The crew of the White Star had become symbols of hope, proof that humanity could endure even the darkest of times. In the halls of the Terran Republic government, leaders vowed to continue the fight, channeling the bravery of the White Star crew into renewed determination. Resources were redirected to the front lines, and recruitment drives brought in thousands of volunteers eager to join the cause. The war was far from over, but the tide was beginning to turn. On board the Eclipse Squadron, Eva stood once again on the bridge, staring out at the stars. The fleet was ready to move out, its ships brimming with resolve. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the ever-present threat of the Krylos. But Eva knew one thing for certain: humanity would not go quietly into the night. "We hold the line," she murmured, repeating Logan's final words to her. "For them, for all of us." And with that, she gave the order to engage engines. The fleet surged forward, disappearing into the vastness of space, carrying with it the legacy of the White Star. Somewhere beyond the stars, the echoes of their bravery continued to resonate.